every time a democracy has fallen to an authoritarian, it has always followed the same playbook, the same path. First, that authoritarian gains power through illegitimate means, either through election fraud or a military coup. Then they go through and they attack free speech, and they go after gun rights, the ability of the public to defend themselves. And we are seeing the same thing play out with Joe Biden. We have proven that Joe Biden's occupation of the White House is wholeheartedly unconstitutional. Even before you get to the voting machines, even before you get to all the ballot stuffing, from dead people who didn't even exist, from addresses that don't exist, or people voting multiple times, before you even get to that, his occupation of the White House is unconstitutional solely on the basis that the election in 2020 in numerous states violated the Constitution because they were not conducted in the time, place, and manner as outlined by the state legislatures of those states. And the Constitution is very clear that the state legislatures have the sole authority to determine the time, place, and manner. And so once they violated the election laws of their states, in order to get the results of Joe Biden's victory, once they conducted the election illegally, they made any possibility of a Joe Biden presidency wholeheartedly illegal and unconstitutional. That, and the Constitution says that the electors in the Electoral College would be determined by the state legislature or in a manner in which they direct. And since the elections were operated illegally and unconstitutionally, that means the electors were not selected in the manner in which the state legislature directed. So even before we get to everything else, those two things make Joe Biden's presidency unconstitutional and illegitimate. But authoritarians don't care about legitimacy. They care only about power. And so after they gain power illegitimately, they always make the first two moves. They attack your free speech, and they attack your right to keep and bear arms. After all, they need to be able to find a way to maintain that power and prevent an uprising. So they attack free speech in order to censor information so as to have an uninformed populace. The less informed the people are of the truth, the less likely they are to uprise, revolt, or stand up to the government. And also, it's to isolate everybody and make them feel alone. If no one's allowed to talk about the truth and what really happened, then everyone feels like they're isolated and alone. And we have seen, ever since the election, the internet being censored, history being rewritten, digital evidence being destroyed and altered. We already know the truth about what happened in the 2020 election, but we're not allowed to talk about it, all except for on a few key platforms. And how long we're going to be able to do that, I don't know. But we know that the First Amendment is under assault. We know that information is basically not allowed anymore. But now we also see that they are going after our Second Amendment rights. See, it's just like every authoritarian before him. Because the Democrats are going for broke. They have been at a war, engaged in a war with the constitutional republic for well over 20 years. And when they saw that Trump had won the 2016 election, they realized that if they were to ever get power again, it would be the last time they would be able to do so. Because their ability to control and manipulate everybody is waning. And therefore, this is their last opportunity. We already see that as a result of the 2020 elections, that new election laws are being passed by state legislatures in order to prevent the fraudulent activity from being able to happen again. And without fraud, the Democrats can't win. They can't win your vote. They can only seek to fraudulently override your vote. So they realize this is their last opportunity, and they are going for broke. And now they're going off and they're attacking our Second Amendment rights, which is very predictable. And of course, they're using, baseless arguments that don't even make sense, trying to compare apples and oranges and tell you that it's an apples to apples comparison. So here's Joe Biden trying to justify or rationalize his continued treason against the Constitution of the United States and the people thereof.
Also, today we're taking steps to confront not just the gun crisis, but what is actually a public health crisis. Nothing I'm about to recommend in any way impinges on the Second Amendment. They're phony arguments suggesting that these are Second Amendment rights at stake from what we're talking about. But no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. We call it freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted to own. From the very beginning the Second Amendment existed, certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. So the idea is just bizarre to suggest that some of the things we're recommending are contrary to the Constitution.
No, Joe Biden, the exact opposite is true. Everything that you are recommending is contrary to the Constitution and a complete violation. But, why would we ever expect you to abide by the Constitution? You got into office by violating the Constitution. Now, his phony arguments, such as the First Amendment doesn't allow you to yell fire in a movie theater, that argument doesn't hold water or weight in any way, shape, or form, because the First Amendment isn't about the movie theaters. And I know some of you are going, well, they didn't have, these type of guns and, back then either. But let's actually go off and explain. See, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech to speak out against the government, to protest the government, to speak out against members of the government, laws and policies that they recommend. A movie theater is not owned, controlled, or operated by the government. Private businesses do have the ability to say, hey, if you're doing business here, you have to abide by certain rules and conduct. Secondly, yelling fire in a movie theater has nothing to do about a politician, a law, or a policy. The First Amendment is all about being able to speak out against the government. Of course, if you were to try and say, something bad about somebody that wasn't actually true, that's libel, right? But that's not about the government. The First Amendment is about being able to speak out against the government. So his whole argument in trying to use the whole movie theater and fire is trying to compare apples and oranges. It's a misdirect, an attempt to try and confuse you, or at least the attempt to try and confuse the uninformed, in order to make his second phony argument that no amendment is absolute. Yes, actually, every amendment is absolute. It's our Bill of Rights. It's our contract between the government and the people. It is absolute. Because if it's not absolute, then you might as well be saying that the Constitution doesn't actually exist. We don't have any guaranteed rights unless the rights that are stated to be guaranteed are absolute. What his argument amounts to here, and trying to say, oh, nothing is absolute, and therefore, we do have the ability to engage in gun control, and it's not unconstitutional. That argument is to say that we don't actually have a constitution. That argument that he is trying to make is saying that we don't have any guaranteed rights in this country, that we only get what the government allows us to have. That we can only say what the government allows us to say. We can only arm ourselves so long as the government doesn't disagree with it. That's not how the Constitution works. Because, yes, this may be repetitive, but his whole argument, the left's whole argument that the Constitution is a living document that just magically evolves itself, but only they're able to interpret it, or that no rights under the Constitution and any of the amendments from the First Amendment to the Last Amendment is absolute, is just them just saying, hey, you being allowed to do this, speak up against the government or have firearms or protection from unreasonable search and seizures or the right to not self-incriminate, those aren't actual rights. Those are just benefits that the government allows, but can take away at any moment. You understand, his whole argument is that the Constitution doesn't actually exist, that we don't have any guarantees under the Constitution, and that they just get to do whatever they want, whenever they want. Everything that he is recommending is unconstitutional. Now, just because they have been able to violate the Constitution numerous times, and they have already violated the Second Amendment throughout American history multiple times, doesn't mean that it's right or constitutional or legal for them to engage in the same unconstitutional violations that they have in the past. That's basically trying to say that just because we did something wrong before, it means that we get to do something wrong again. Now, the actual truth here, beyond all of his lies, him trying to say, well, you couldn't own any type of firearm that you wanted when the country was first. Actually, you could, if you could afford it. The type of guns that you had was based off of whether or not you could afford it. It wasn't a government limitation. It was an income limitation. You can't buy something that you couldn't afford. And actually, the first gun control law ever passed in the United States actually required everybody to own a gun. Everything that he says is just a lie, and he doesn't care. He doesn't care because he knows the media is going to be there to try and sell the lie. He knows that no matter what he makes up, no matter what he says, the media is going to be there to try and push it, cover it up, and that everybody, on the left is going to be trying to defend the lie, and that he knows the so-called fact checkers are going to try and push the lie and claim that it's true, and therefore by the so-called fact checkers promoting the same lie that he is promoting, it gives Facebook the opportunity to claim, oh, no, we're not censoring speech, we're censoring misinformation. You understand how they have gone about this. How they've gone about the fraudulent censorship of free speech and trying to claim it's a censorship of misinformation and employing fact checkers. You basically have all the propagandists in positions to tell you what is and isn't true. And of course, the propaganda they push is always true, and any actual truth is labeled misinformation. Are we really surprised? No, we're not. We knew this was coming. I told you months ago that this is what was going to happen. I told you months ago that they were going to push for unconstitutional gun control acts, that they were going to be violating the Constitution every day. It's predictable. It's what every tyrant, every authoritarian, every murderous villain throughout the history of the world has done after they have overthrown a democracy. So no, under no circumstances would we abide by any of this. If he tries to do gun confiscations, good luck. We're not turning over any of our guns. Joe Biden is more likely to trigger a civil war than he is to actually implement gun control. The country is barely hanging on the way it is. He's like all other tyrants. After getting into office, he's had to have military protection, which I'm very disappointed in the military. They're supposed to defend the Constitution. And those who have been posted in Washington, D.C. have failed to uphold that oath. So where does this leave us? It leaves us as ensuring that we maintain our Second Amendment rights is the only way that we can protect ourselves from the tyrants. Because what do you think is going to happen if anybody ever actually caved in and decided that they were going to go along with the gun control, turn over some guns, and abide by anything Joe Biden's trying to outline? What do you think is going to happen? Take a look at the actions of the left. Beyond the 2020 elections, beyond the assault on free speech, we also see the left and their takeover of private corporations trying to go off and coerce society into the direction of the Democrats. Agree with the Democrats or you can't get a job. Agree with the Democrats or the government's going to target you. IRS or maybe the intelligence community, whatever. Agree with the government or you're going to be blocked from or agree with the Democrats or you're going to be blocked from financial institutions. So we take a look at all of that. I mean, we've already seen examples of the Democrats and their extremists at the top of corporations that they've managed to get a stranglehold on, trying to, act as a shadow government to dictate to state legislatures how they will and will not operate, such as this.
Briefly on Georgia, when the president voiced his support for moving it, does he have any regret now that by doing that, by adding his voice, it may have contributed to the environment where MLB makes this decision, and then there are these economic consequences to people in Georgia? When he and the vice president were there and couldn't do the car rally, and I talked about wanting to thank Georgia. Georgia's been important to the president and vice president electorally. Is there a sense of regret that perhaps he tipped the scale with his rhetoric, even if he doesn't have a direct cause and effect?
Well, he was answering a direct question during an interview with ESPN about the opening day baseball, something most people in the country appreciate and enjoy. And he was simply conveying that he would support that decision if that decision was made by Major League Baseball, just like he would support decisions made by private sector companies. We're not standing here and calling for companies to boycott. That's not what our focus is on from the White House. We do believe that the focus on Georgia is a reminder that, and it should be a reminder, I should say, that this is much bigger than Georgia, that Georgia was just one of the first states to act on a concerted effort to use easily disprovable conspiracy theories to fuel their attempts to make it even harder for eligible Americans to vote. But according to the Brennan Center, as of March 24th, 361 bills with restrictive provisions have been introduced in 47 states around the country. So this is not just Georgia. This is something we are seeing a prevalence of this, a pattern around the country of, an effort to make it more difficult to vote.
Yeah, it's not just Georgia. See, they're trying to go off and use Georgia as an example here, but it is the larger picture here. Businesses, if they want to be able to continue to operate, must bow down to the left. Otherwise, all the way up to the presidency is going to be sending them warnings. Hey, you better do this or else. And then those businesses capitulate to the authoritarians running the government at the moment. And it's top-down control, dictatorship. It's kind of like the mob. Hey, it would be a real shame here if someone came in here and robbed the place. But we can protect you from that. And you go, oh, wait, are you threatening to rob the place? No. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it would be a real shame if that happened. The idle threats, letting them know what could happen. And so you got the Democrats going off threatening businesses. Hey, you better do this or else we're going to regulate you out of business. Hey, it would be, real shame if you came under a federal investigation, for something. It could be real costly. Or, but, if you were to say do X, Y, Z, I think you would do just fine. Or you get, it's the mob approach. And so we see Joe Biden weigh in on a situation. We see an organization capitulate to what they believe Joe Biden wants them to do. And we see that through private entities and organizations, businesses, how they can then, extort, citizens, through threats of lost jobs, lost access to financial institutions, or threaten states due to damaging their state's economy intentionally if they try to stop the corruption, stop the left's authoritarian desires. We see that. It's no surprise. And the left is completely predictable. They are like a mob. It's just really sad. And this is why they need to, go for broke here, because we are not putting up with it anymore. Which is why they had to engage in the level of fraud that they had engaged in. But, they always want to go around and try to spin it as if somehow being authoritarian is pro-democracy. overthrowing democracy is for our own benefit. The truth about what happened is a conspiracy. I mean, they're just a bunch of frauds and liars. We already know what the left is all about. And if we don't start doing something soon, we're going to find ourselves the same as Venezuela and every other democracy that has fallen to authoritarian. And we see it coming. But I guess it's true what they say. The best way for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And right now, evil's prevailing because good people are doing nothing. And it's going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And we know that the Democrats, what they're going to be trying to do is they're going to try and pack the courts. We know that they're going to try and pack the Supreme Court. That way, all of their future authoritarian actions won't be able to be challenged through any of the constitutional means of lawsuits. You know, that path will be cut off because they're going to basically overthrow the courts. But there are things that we do need to do here. You know, and I wouldn't go straight to violence, but we need to actually start engaging in some boycotts ourselves as Republicans. We need to let the businesses know that we're not going to accept this, that if they're going to go off and try and dictate political policy to us and try and state that we need to agree with, fund with, or, you know, speak out in support of the Democrats in order to have jobs, access to financial institutions, and all of that, well, we need to let them know that that's not going to fly. And that means being more proactive, you know, boycotting, stop funding, you know, these companies, you know, stop buying their products, stop buying their services, and start funding startups of conservative businesses. You know, if they want to go ahead and bifurcate the system, we can. But as we have learned, that's easier said than done. I mean, take a look at what has happened with social media. We say, hey, you know, we don't like these. They tell us go build your own. We build our own. What do? They ban them from app stores, get them deplatformed, you know, take out their servers. You know, so they're going to go ahead and try and rig the system in any way, shape, or form. But the one thing that they can't rig is the fact that we can refuse to do business with the companies that engage in implementing left-wing tyranny. They can't force us to spend money, can they? Well, at least not yet. And I'm not the only one who has come up with this idea. You know, I'm just reiterating what many others have already said.
How did the corporate culture, the corporate suite, if you will, become part of the woke culture?
Thanks, David. I think part of the answer is it's essentially craven and cowardly is what they're doing. I don't for one second believe that any of these CEOs, any of these top corporate figures really believes in the nonsense, the dishonesty that they've spoken about, the Georgia law, or the broader dishonesty that is so associated with this woke cultural movement, the idea that America is so fundamentally systemically racist that the country is somehow, you know, its entire history is illegitimate. If they believe that, if they believed, by the way, all these white men who run these companies, if they believed that they were somehow simply there because they were the product of white privilege and white supremacy, then the right thing for them to do would all be just to step down and to do the honorable thing. Of course, they have no intention of doing that. They don't believe any of this stuff.
Yeah, and you know, I've never been a fan of boycotts. I've never been a fan of that type of action. The left is very good at it, but I've got to say, I'm coming around caving to the left where the pressure comes from. Conservatives have going to have to get smart in doing things that we actually don't like to do, and that's organizing similar boycotts.
Whatever we do, we have to do it fast. The Democrats are just as aware as we are that they are going through an extinction burst, that they are having to get more radical, crazier, and corrupt in order to be able to gain and maintain any type of political power. And given the level of corruption that they had to go through in order to get Joe Biden into the White House, and with all the new election integrity laws to prevent such corruption from being able to happen again, they understand that this is their last shot. And they're going to take full advantage of that to try and permanently overthrow the Constitution, democracy, and implement an authoritarian dictatorship under their rule. And we need to resist that at all costs. Otherwise, we will become Venezuela. We need to make sure companies realize that we're not going to take this woke culture, and boycott them anytime they decide to engage in woke culture, cancel culture, and side with the left. Boycott them. No longer do any type of business with these businesses. We have to make sure that we vigorously defend our First Amendment rights and that we never, under any circumstances, give an inch of surrender to our Second Amendment rights. If we are to have any hope of being able to preserve the Constitution and to bring democracy back, we have to fight vigorously for that. All right. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you're following me on Rumble, thank you. Please share this. If this is your first time watching, please click follow. Maybe you caught this on YouTube, but I doubt it. If you're listening to the audio version of the show, go ahead and make sure that you follow and share that as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back again soon.